Hello and thank you for joining me. What is the point of a university during the pandemic? When death is stalking our race and life as we knew it has been turned on its head, how can students and society justify spending significant amounts of time and money on university degrees? Especially when the topics of those degrees might at times seem trivial and unimportant compared to the big dramas of our day. Every Thursday night the nation claps the NHS and carers, but no one is lining the streets to cheer on lecturers and students of theoretical physics, media studies or human geography. What is the point of a university during the pandemic? And this question needs addressing because of the extreme financial crisis that universities are facing, and the possibility that some could even go bankrupt, and many will need to make cutbacks should the government support them in the way it has the private sector. Not everyone thinks so. The Daily Mail recently thundered that our universities are facing financial chaos and begging for a bailout after years of overexpansion and fat cat salaries. They had it coming to them, basically. University managers are essentially providing two answers, neither of them very convincing. The first is, look, by working on vaccines and treatments or understanding public health responses, we are useful to the fight against COVID-19. Sure, but the vast majority of what universities spend their time and money on is unrelated, and most of this work could be done more cost effectively by specialist research centres or the private sector. The other answer is, universities are important engines of economic activity and social mobility, being vital to the economies of some relatively deprived places. That smacks of desperation. The same multiplier effects could be had more cheaply by FE colleges or public transport projects or factories with good apprenticeship schemes. So this is the question I want to address today. What is the point of universities at this time? Thinking particularly about the humanities. And I'm going to do so by drawing on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Although best known for their fantasy fictions including the Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings, you may have watched the films over the lockdown. I have with my family. They were also both scholars of English literature at Oxford University, and during the Second World War they wrote reflections on scholarship in a world in crisis. And it's these lesser known texts that I will use, concluding by revisiting Lewis's forgotten 1942 visit here to our university. So, firstly, C.S. Lewis points to the fact that universities should be asking the big questions. In October 1939, 1 month after Britain had declared war on Germany, C.S. Lewis delivered a sermon to Oxford students, later published as the essay Learning in Wartime. He began by observing what a strange thing it was for them to be studying during a great war. Your studies may be disrupted by war and military service, but even not, he asked them, how can we continue to take an interest in these placid occupations when the lives of our friends and the liberties of Europe are in the balance? Is it not like fiddling while Rome burns? And this question resonates with us. Instead of the daily newspapers reporting the latest football results or cricket scores, we have a macabre list of new infections and deaths. Economic and social life has been massively disrupted, and this is going to have untold long-term consequences. How on earth can we countenance teaching and learning as usual? Is this not also fiddling while Rome burns? Now, Lewis's answer to his own question was designed to shock his sophisticated listeners. But to a Christian, remember this is a sermon, he says, the true tragedy of Nero must not be that he fiddled while the city was on fire, but that he fiddled on the brink of hell. Lewis elaborated, human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. We're mistaken to compare the war with normal life. Life has never been normal. he says. Human culture has always had to exist under the shadow of something infinitely greater. And if people had postponed the search for knowledge and beauty until they felt secure, that would never have happened. And I think he's onto something here. If these things that we are worth studying today were worth doing before, they are still worth doing. If it was worth asking these big questions about the nature of the good and the true and the beautiful, about the meaning and purpose and value of existence, about how to live a good life in the face of death, about the nature of God and reality, about justice and morality and compassion and coexistence and how we should treat other people, about how the world works and how it came into being and what happens after we die. If it was worth asking these before the pandemic, it is equally worth asking them now. In fact, Lewis suggests, a moment of crisis may be the best time to ask them. The war creates no absolutely new situation, he said. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. The war doesn't increase our chances of dying. They remain exactly 100%, but war makes death more real to us, Lewis argues. It makes it harder for us to forget it. And of course, exactly the same is true of the pandemic. When death is close. I had the privilege last semester of sitting in on a superlatively good undergraduate lecture course on existentialism, taught by our colleague Sinead Murphy. She was trying to convey the existentialist argument that to live well, we need to grapple with the reality of death. But most people don't do that because too many things distract them. I have a feeling that the next cohort of students taking that module will be easier to persuade. So, sure, all of the stuff we do about public health and medicine matters, but it's only a small part of what we do, and lots of other bodies do it too. Raising the big questions about life, the universe and everything is the proper preserve of universities, and, Lewis reminds us, this should be front and central to what we are doing and how we are justifying our existence. I'm sorry, I had to pause my recording there to help my kids with some of their home learning, which is actually a good illustration of what I want to talk about for my second point. And this is based on Tolkien's writing, that the point of universities is to give us glimpses of another world. In the shadow of World War II, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a close friend of Lewis's, wrote a short story called Leaf by Niggle, and it begins like this. There was once a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go, indeed the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry with his preparations. As the story proceeds, we learn that Niggle is a painter, but not a very successful one, Tolkien writes, partly because he had many other things to do. Most of these things he thought were a nuisance, but he did them fairly well when he could not get out of them, which, in his opinion, was far too often. And these niggles were things like acquaintances popping round for tea, but principally the frequent and annoying demands of a lazy neighbour called Parish. Aware that the journey is about to take place, and by now the reader has understood that this journey is death, Niggle decides to focus on his great project, a tree, and the whole landscape behind it on a vast canvas set up in his studio. But all he had ever got done in life was one leaf. Yet Parish comes and says his roof is leaking, it's raining, his wife is ill, and could Niggle please cycle to town to get the doctor? Niggle does so, but he catches a cold, and the driver comes to take him on the journey, death. His canvas is used to patch up Parish's roof, and only a little bit of it survives, the bit with the leaf on. It is framed and put in the town's museum with the title Leaf by Niggle, hence the title of the story. But eventually the museum burned down and he's forgotten. But The story continues. The journey by train eventually takes him to a new land, which we come to understand as allegorical of heaven. As he walks through it, suddenly he comes upon a tree, which he realises is the tree that he had been painting. Before him, writes Tolkien, stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Nigel had so often felt or guessed, and had so often failed to catch. All the leaves he had ever laboured at were there, as he had imagined them, rather than as he had made them, and there were others that had only budded in his mind, and many that might have budded if he only had had the time. They were just exquisite leaves. Now, this story was written just before World War II. Tolkien was struggling to complete Lord of the Rings. Niggles kept distracting him, and the threat of World War II made these worse. Would he ever be able to complete it? Would the country be invaded? Would he be killed? The meaning of this story has been much debated, but I think it would be fair to the author's intentions to see these glimpses, to see these leaves as glimpses of another reality, whilst recognising that our work towards that is always incomplete. Theologian Tim Keller, from the perspective of a belief in the restoration of all creation at the end of time, writes this of the story. Maybe you went into town planning with a vision about what a real city should look like. You are likely to be discouraged. Or maybe you studied to become a lawyer, pursuing a vision for justice and a society ruled by peace and equity. You will get disillusioned because you will find that as much as you are trying to work on important things, much of what you do is minutiae. Once or twice in your life you may feel you have finally gotten a leaf out. But, writes Keller, whatever your work, you need to know this. There really is a tree. Whatever you are seeking in your work, the city of justice and peace, the world of brilliance and beauty, the story, the order, the healing, it is there. Your work will only be partially successful on your best days in bringing that world about. But inevitably, the whole tree that you seek, the beauty, harmony, justice, comfort, joy and community will come to fruition. Much of what we do in universities as academics and students is beset by niggles. And the pandemic adds many more. The pandemic is niggles with steroids. So much time is taken up in caring responsibilities, in finding pasta in supermarkets, in trying to figure out how to get Zoom to work, etc. And will only ever be partially completed. But it points to better ways of living and being. Much of how we do society is up for grabs after this pandemic. Because there has never been normal life, as Lewis put it, it isn't a question of going back to something, but rather how can we create societies that are more marked by justice and peace and love and restoration and healing and community than the ones that we had before. University's most crucial work is to offer glimpses of that society. So in conclusion, I've argued that university study, and in particular the study of the humanities, is important. But what sort of humanities and what sort of human? One of the longest standing elements of our Insights public lecture programme, of which this talk forms a part, is the Riddell Memorial Lectures. In 1942, C.S. Lewis came up here to Newcastle University, King's College, as it was called then, and delivered these lectures, later published in a hugely influential book, a deceptively short book called The Abolition of Man, subtitled Reflections on Education. Although it's primarily about natural law, he warned of the dangers of articulating concepts of humans that empty them of objective moral value. Lewis's lecture reminds us how important the question is: what sort of humanities do we want in a post-pandemic world? And there are lots of different answers. Richard Dawkins begins his best-selling book, The Selfish Gene, with a tirade against the humanities. Nothing written before 1859, he writes, can help us in the humanities. Nothing written, that is, before the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species has anything at all to teach us. He argues instead for a humanities that is completely refashioned along the lines of his understanding of evolutionary biology. And his preferred image is what he calls successful Chicago gangsters. These are people marked by toughness, aggression, and chiefly a ruthless selfishness. And as machines created by our genes, we are characterised primarily by selfishness, and this should be the basis of university teaching. Why do I mention this? Well, my recent research has been on the meaning of the human in human resource management regimes. Amongst the most degrading cases I found were systems of managing people based on targets, rewards, and punishments. The single most egregious example of this type was arguably the model pioneered by Enron's CEO, Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling implemented a system known as rank and yank. He had all employees measured against targets and ranked every 6 months. He offered lavish bonuses to the top 5%, while the bottom 15% were relocated or fired. This system of ruthless competition cultivated just the type of personalities you'd expect. As one Enron employee put it, if I'm going to my boss's office to talk about compensation, and if I step on some guy's throat and that doubles it, then I'll stomp on that guy's throat. That's chilling stuff. And Enron collapsed in 2001 in one of the biggest corporate scandals in US history. Skilling himself was only finally released from jail last year. But where did Skilling get his ideas from? He claimed he was inspired by reading The Selfish Gene. You see, ideas have legs. Ideas don't just exist in university lecture halls and books, they walk out into the real world. The vast majority of judges, of politicians, of school teachers, of journalists, of other opinion formers are educated at universities. What they imbibe will influence what they do and how they remake society. And that's why teaching matters so profoundly. Are there not better visions of humanity around which we could be building our teaching than those offered by Dawkins? Lewis points towards them, but one is suggested by another visitor to our university, Martin Luther King, who came in 1967 to receive an honorary degree. As recent scholarship has emphasised, King's entire life, thought and action was rooted in the ethical conception of the biblical idea that humans are created imago Dei, in the image of God. Because every human being has etched in his personality the indelible stamp of the Creator, King said, every individual has innate worth shared in equal portions and must be treated as such. Returning to my own discipline, for King this inevitably had geopolitical implications. As he said in his last Christmas sermon before he was murdered, recorded just after he returned from Newcastle, it really boils down to this: all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave your job? You can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world. You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for the sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen and drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea. That's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognise this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. The pandemic has made a world that was already more fenced and bordered than at any time in human history, even more bordered. It is hard to imagine a complete rollback of that anytime soon. It is such a geographical vision as kings, built on his understanding of humans as being created with intrinsic value, that we need in a COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 world. Universities, at their best, are the custodian of such visions as we think, write, engage and teach. And doing that is the point of a university in a pandemic, as at any other time.